first off, and most important, I'm so grateful to all the speakers for coming a long ways to get here. Each of the Lorraine drove all the way from Ottawa and her husband. Bernaine drove from North Bay with a friend. And Chris drove all the way from Walkerton or Brockton area. And so everyone was like 3 to 5 hours trip. So I'm very grateful. I see people will be rolling in, so that's good. Keep on coming. So I'd also very much like to appreciate the offer from Maggie for this space. She offered it for free, the Anglican Church, and it's a perfect, small, intimate space. We're really grateful to Maggie for that. And groups that helped co-organize and get the word out through promotions and co-sponsored was Rising Tide Toronto, Blue Water, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Greenpeace, OPERG U of T, OPERG York, Voice of Women for Peace, PeaceWorks, Canadian Peace, CPT, Christian Peacemakers Team, Centre for Social Justice, and Now Magazine for the fantastic promotions of this event. So thank you to everybody, and to Dave, whose idea spawned this whole event, and lots of hard work. So thank you, Dave, postering and such. Thank you, everybody. My name is Angela Bischoff, and I am the Outreach Director for the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And this is what I do all day, every day, is work to build opposition to the province's plans to rebuild 10 nuclear reactors in this province. And I'll talk a little bit more about that over the course of the next 2 hours. Uranium mining. She grew up in Elliot Lake, a uranium mining town in northern Ontario, and her dad was a uranium miner. Her first job was as a reporter for the town newspaper, where she delved into the issues of the mine, the impacts, the risks, the leaks, the local politics, until, of course, her column was cut. Then she got a job as editor of an Aboriginal newspaper in Blind River, home of a nuclear refinery. There she learned and wrote more while she watched her dad and others die of lung cancer and other illnesses associated with radioactive industries. She co-edited this book, This is My Homeland, which is a testimony of the impacts of uranium mining on the lives of the Indigenous people at Serpent River First Nation. And she continues to speak out about the legacy of this dangerous industry in her communities. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for driving all the way here from Ottawa to be with us today.
I'd like to thank the organizers for doing this important work, for bringing people together to discuss issues that are relevant to every human being on the planet. I'd like to thank the elder for his words of wisdom, opening our session this morning. I'd like to acknowledge the territory of the Indigenous people on whose territory we're standing today. I have a really long slideshow that I probably won't go through, and I have 15 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the waste at Elliot Lake, and I don't know how familiar you are with the area, but it was the largest uranium mine in the world in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think the last mine closed, and I think it was Stanley Mine closed in 1993. I guess the focus on Elliot Lake really is to look at waste, nuclear waste, how it was treated, what kind of volumes we're talking about in mining. If you look at the area, of course, it's Anishinaabe territory. It was, there are settlements and archaeological evidence that tell us that the Indigenous people were there for thousands and thousands of years. And it is an area that is covered by treaty. It's the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. So underlying all that development are unresolved Indigenous rights issues. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about the land, when we talk about development on land in Canada, that Canadians have obligations and responsibilities, and they are legal, contractual obligations and responsibilities to honor and uphold treaties that they have signed with Indigenous peoples. Meaning that the intent was to share and use the land in a good way for the benefit of human beings, but also for the benefit of ecosystems and everything that exists in the ecosystem. So that talks a little bit about the geography of the area. So in the world, so when we look at, I put these slides in here about the Manhattan Project and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because whatever we do is never really isolated from anything else that's happening in the world. We like to sort of be myopic as Canadians and look in our backyard and see what's going on. And there's a tendency to not really pay attention to things that are happening in the world around us. So when uranium was being mined at Elliot Lake, there was a lot of nuclear development that was weapons-based going on. And the original contracts, they were feeding into the Manhattan Project, and Canadians always believed that they had signed a non-proliferation treaty. The Manhattan Project was the project to construct the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was a nuclear weapons project. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that when we look at development of the nuclear chain, that you never look at that project in isolation of things that are happening in other parts of the world. It's always connected somehow. There's always some kind of link or connection. So there was a lot of government and political intervention into mining the uranium at Elliot Lake. And there was a commitment to stockpile even though the world market price had dropped. So Elliot Lake continued to mine uranium and stockpile it even though there was no market. And it was a purely political decision to intervene to keep jobs intact. And Elliot Lake was actually bankrolled. It was completely financed by the federal and provincial government. So it's a town, if you're driving north and you go right onto the Trans-Canada Highway, you actually have to leave the highway for about 30 kilometers north to go to this place, which it was built actually as a mining camp to house the workers that were digging the uranium out of the ground. And the owners of the mine convinced the province to build the highway, which I think was something in the order of $500 million, to build the highway into Elliot Lake, construct housing that was all engineered and masterminded by the owners of the corporations to keep their labor force local, basically to make sure that their miners were there, to fulfill the contracts that they had signed, which were 20-year contracts with Ontario Hydro. So it's again, I think it has similarities when you think about the Ring of Fire. I don't know if you're following the Ring of Fire development, but remote areas call for government intervention, calls for the government to bankroll these projects. So it was a very large deposit, discovered in 1953, and it was again, it's open market. The government encourages people to run out and stake claims, dig up the earth as fast as they can, and apply for their permits and get their mine. And there's no landscape evaluation. They don't look at impact on ecosystems. They just want to encourage development, investment, job creation, and you produce a commodity, you get it off to a market as fast as you can. So there was no real plan. It was just wherever the mines, you get to the claims office as fast as you can and stake your claim, and you start digging holes in the ground as quickly as you can. It was a horrible, horrible tale with Denison mines. When Denison opened, they had signed contracts to produce uranium. They were bound by timelines according to the contract, and the mine wasn't ready yet. But the guys were in there digging the rock out of the ground. And the engineers came to the mine owner and they said, "We have a problem. with ventilation. There's no ventilation. And we need to open another shaft to ventilate the area before we go in. And the mine owner, who was Stephen Roman, said, no, absolutely not. Get in there, get that rock out. Ventilation, be damned. So in mining uranium, it's very dangerous because you're exposed to a lot of radioactive material, which causes cancer. So we've seen cancers, aside from silicosis, stomach cancers, you've seen cancers of the salivatory glands, very strange cancers that even workers' comp won't recognize from these miners. And it could be from any number of things. I mean, they're ingesting, they're working underground, they're eating their lunch underground, the contaminants are on their clothes and in their lunch pail. So it is a known fact, it's an indisputable fact that mining uranium causes cancer and it kills miners. And workers' compensation pays them out a claim. My father was one of those men that worked underground. And I asked him why he was working underground. I said, you're digging up this uranium, you're polluting the environment, you're creating all this waste. And my father said to me, what do you propose I do? I've got a grade 6 education. Where do I go? I've got 5 kids. And that was a predicament. I mean, it was, really, to me, as a young person, challenging my parent, saying, why are you doing this? And him responding to me that way, I had no answer for him. And this is what happens, I think, when you get into the system and you don't look around and you just, you're working, you get your paycheck, you make a mortgage payment, you buy groceries. And when you pull back and you look at the 10 lakes that were sacrificed to nuclear waste, and the illness and the cost. So it's never been calculated. So I don't know if you can see this. This is an old book. I think it is. Why do I think it's the Roman Empire? I think it is the book about Stephen Roman. But this is the Big Z deposit. So you see, here's the Indian Reserve. This is Serpent River here. This is the Lake Huron. This is the highway that they punched in to get to Elliot Lake. And the deposits, all the mines are here. So you see, this is the watershed. So this is where the water flows from the mine waste down the Serpent River to Cutler into Lake Huron. You can't see it, but over here, just west is Blind River, where they have the nuclear refinery. So that gives you a sense of the area, what it looks like. And these mines, some of these mines were opened before there was any permitting or licensing to regulate the mines. So the waste was deposited, and when it went through an environmental assessment, the federal government was actually arguing against incorporating the unlicensed mine into its environmental assessment. So they were going to do an environmental assessment on decommissioning, only considering the mines that had been actually licensed, not the mines that were operating and abandoned.
Sorry, what decade?
Pardon me?
What decade?
What decade was it? 90s. So, in the 90s. So, which really doesn't make any sense. So it had nothing to do, the scope of the environmental assessment was really narrow. At the end of the day, I've got 5 minutes. I'm talking as fast as I can. This is a 2-day presentation. But anyway, at the end of the day, what they did was they flooded the tailings. So when they were mining the rock, they were, in some cases where they were taking out 1 pound of uranium for every ton of rock, every ton of waste. And the waste, so in mining, they were using sulfuric acid to leach the uranium out of the rock, and all the waste, whatever it was, diesel fuel, it just got pumped out into 10 lakes. And the decommissioning plan when the mines closed was approved by the federal government, and it was to flood the tailings and keep them maintained beneath water cover so they wouldn't oxidize. And so the last presentation that I saw on the decommissioning plan was that the sulfuric acid in the tailings had leached out, because that became a parameter for monitoring, was the sulfuric acid. They were monitoring the sulfuric acid that was migrating out of the tailings down the Serpent River watershed. And the way they would measure it was by how acidic the water was and how much lime they would have to add to neutralize that emission. So because they had to add less and less lime, they're calling it a success, saying that the tailings are coming along just nicely. But what concerned me was a federal scientist who told me that the sulfuric acid that was in the tailings may have actually been keeping the radionuclides at bay from migrating. And now that the sulfuric acid was gone, there was a matter of time before the radioactive material started to leach out and migrate down the Serpent River watershed. So the problem with the environmental assessment is because they've reached their objective, they've removed the monitoring stations. So it'd be really difficult to start measuring when this radioactive material starts to move. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure my time is up. I can go? Another 5 minutes? But I really wanted to impress on you, I think, the technology that they were using was, I would call it no technology at all. It was called state-of-the-art engineering and mine waste management. That's the catchphrase that industry like to use. Basically, it was just dumping radioactive material, mine waste, into existing lakes and then shoring it up with some boulders and what they call riprap is like rock. So this slide here talks a little about expropriation of land, and I did say at the beginning that this land is covered by treaty. There is a First Nation. It's actually an Indian reserve under the Indian Act at Serpent River. And Serpent River, you saw the map, is right on, it's actually right on Lake Huron. So there's access to fresh water. So in uranium mining, they needed to produce sulfuric acid. And what the government decided to do was expropriate land from Serpent River Band and build a sulfuric acid plant in the heart of the village. And that, it was actually strategically placed because they had access to the water from Lake Huron, but there were mines to the east of Serpent River and mines to the north of Serpent River, and then there was Pronto Mine, which was west. So Serpent River was a really good location for a sulfuric acid plant, and they could feed those three mills in those three mines. And it was actually put forward as an opportunity and an idea that First Nation people could get into the wage economy by working in the sulfuric acid plant. And that's why the Department of Indian Affairs was involved. But there is a research paper looking at the history of how that happened, and there was a lot of dirty dealings that went down between staff inside the Department of Indian Affairs and some of the officials that worked for Noranda. So it became, at the end of the day, it became just a nightmare for the small village of Serpent River First Nation to have this sulfuric acid plant in the heart of their community, contaminating the soil, impacting the health of the workers and the people living outside outside of the plant. So I haven't had any success. I've looked at research papers on what are the impacts of sulfuric acid plant emissions on nearby communities. But everything I've found really just talks about health and safety of workers inside the plant. So there hasn't been any real epidemiological work Other than the stories of the people who lived there. My mother told me that they used to hang their laundry on the line, and they would take it in at the end of the day, and it would have holes in it. So, I know you're talking about expansion of Bruce Nuclear. I know that's the focus. I just want you to recognize that this is part of the chain of that development. And this legacy, it should never be repeated. This should never happen again anywhere. And so the work is there. I mean, there's 60 years worth of work, 60 years worth of history to draw from to make a case against mining uranium. So with that, I'd like to say miigwech for your time.
Thank you. Don't forget.